Hello and welcome. Today we talk to Brian Ahearn. He's the author of the Amazon bestseller Influence People. He's one of the only 20 people in the world who have been trained and certified by Robert Cialdini himself. He's also the Chief Influence Officer at Influence People. Enjoy the conversation. You are one of the 20 people who have been certified by Robert Cialdini himself.
Well, the backstory is I worked for an insurance company, and somebody who worked in my department was studying for their master's, and during their class, they saw a video of Robert Cialdini. So she brought that video into my boss and I, gave it to us and said, I think you guys are going to really like this. I was working in the sales department, responsible for training our field salespeople. I watched the video, the light bulb came on. I said to myself, this is the underpinning of all sales. The psychology that he is talking about is either why certain sales approaches work and why certain ones don't. I also appreciated that everything he was talking about was based on research. That gave me confidence to go out and talk about it too. And then the third thing was his stance on ethics. He talked about non-manipulative ways to get people to do things. And that resonated with the moral part of me. Now, the interesting thing, Rachit, was I started using the video, was getting all kinds of great feedback as I interacted with people. The video was made at Stanford University, so I signed up for their marketing. They had lots of other great materials. But one day, one of their marketing flyers came across my desk, and as I flipped through it, I saw Robert Cialdini's picture. In big bold letters at the top, it said bestseller, and then right underneath it, call it influence, persuasion, or even manipulation. And I just was like, oh, I can't believe they used that word. He's so clear about non-manipulative ways to do things. So I emailed Stanford, and basically in the email said this: I don't know anybody who wants to be manipulated, and I don't know anybody who wants to be known as a good manipulator. The word cannot be helping your sales, but it's probably really hurting. True. Never heard from Stanford, but sometime later my phone rang at work, and it was a representative from Influence at Work, Robert Cialdini's organization. And she said, I'm calling to thank you on behalf of Dr. Cialdini. You sent an email to Stanford, and because of that, they're changing the marketing of all of our materials. And I was like, wow, that is really cool. So we had a little bit of a conversation, and before she hung up, she said, if your company ever needs a guest speaker, Dr. Cialdini travels the world to talk about this. And I said, well, hey, I sit next to the woman who plans our events and books our speakers. You want to talk to her? And I transfer her over, and as fate would have it, it was the summer of 2004, and Robert Cialdini was in Columbus, Ohio a couple of times to address the insurance agents that represented our company. And that is how my relationship with him started.
Why do you think most times it's very difficult to incorporate these learnings in your daily life? Because how I look at this is a lot of these things like reciprocity, authority, consensus, liking, social proof, a lot of these are in some sense feels like common knowledge, but it still becomes very difficult in most times to incorporate that in your daily life. How to get better at that?
Well, common knowledge, unfortunately, is uncommon, it seems. I think people mistakenly think because you explain a concept to them and they get it because they're human beings, and they either think, oh, maybe that's why people respond to me, or, oh, maybe that's why I bought from that salesperson. So you're describing human behavior to human beings, they get it. But what I find the vast majority of the time when people say, oh, I know that stuff, or I already incorporate that, they don't.
That's coming from a place of personal bias most often than not.
Absolutely. They think, we all think that we're better than we are in so many things. Lots of studies show that we all think we're better than average. And these people, a lot of times that I interact with, think that they're using this. But when I get them into a 2-day workshop and they really deeply learn these concepts, and then we put them into situations where they have to put it into practice, they struggle and they start to realize, wow, it's one thing to understand it. It's another thing to put it into practice. So I think there's a little self-deception there that, oh, I already know that, I'm doing that. And then the other thing I would say too is habits are hard to change. When you're asking somebody to rethink how they're approaching individuals and incorporate this, they're having to change themselves. And that's always difficult.
And what's a good way to get better at it? Do you get better at it by practice, or do you have some mental models that you use?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to learn it. And once you start to understand it, you begin to see your opportunities to implement it. And then the next step is actually utilizing it. And so influence is a skill like almost everything else that we do in life. The more you learn, the more you practice, the better you get. But I like your question about, is there a model? Because it's one thing to know about healthy living, what is a good diet, what is good working out. It's another thing to actually put a plan together so that you can eat better and then exercise and do things. And we do have different approaches in terms of how we do this. One of the things that we talk about is Dr. Cialdini's partner, Gregory Neidert, Dr. Neidert, came up with something that he calls the core motives model. And it looks at, do we need to build or strengthen a relationship? If so, there's a few principles that we use. Do we need to get somebody past a state of uncertainty? If that's the challenge, then there's a few principles that we use. And it may be that somebody knows you, they like you, and they're not unsure what to do. They're just not motivated to actually take the action. There's a few principles that we can utilize there. And that gives a really good framework for the 6 principles of influence that Robert Cialdini introduced in his book, Influence, Science, and Practice.
Do you think self-awareness plays a part in influencing others or getting influenced ourselves? And what are some ways to get more aware of our own blind spots?
Well, self-awareness in virtually anything you do is good. It's always going to help you to be more self-aware. And I think you start to become very self-aware as you learn about these principles. And then you go, oh my gosh, I'm watching this presidential election. I know how these candidates are trying to influence me to vote for them. Oh, wow, I just saw that commercial. Now I understand why that marketer is taking that particular approach, because it will probably get more people. So that self-awareness starts happening where you recognize how you're being potentially influenced. But then where the rubber meets the road for most people in terms of success is, how do I now take this understanding and put it into practice so I can ethically influence people? Because I'm a firm believer that so much of your professional success rests on your ability to get people to say yes to you and actually do what you need them to do. And understanding influence, how people think and behave, is a perfect way to make that happen.
For a world which is so polarized, things like influence and persuasions become so much more important than your hearts.
Absolutely. My blog post, which will go out later today, is encouraging people that reciprocity is at play here. And reciprocity in that there's a lot of negativity and there's a lot of anger and animosity, I think, from people who voted for Joe Biden against people who were voting for Donald Trump because of how many Trump supporters treated them when Donald Trump won. But you're always at a point where you can make a choice and you say, you know what? If I return anger and animosity back the other way, I am probably going to get more of that. That's reciprocity. Whatever you put out, you tend to get back. If I treat you kindly, you're more likely to treat me kindly. But if I treat you badly, you're more likely to treat me badly. We have an opportunity right now. If people say, you know what, I don't like how I was treated by the other side last time, but I don't want that to continue. And I'm going to do everything I can to treat them with humility, graciousness, compassion, positive things, in the hopes that many of them will return humility, grace, etc. But if we say, like, screw them, I'm just going to treat them the way they treated me, we will remain in this negative cycle. And I don't think anybody really wants that. So somebody has to take the first step.
So it's almost like trying to actively seek the good parts in other people.
I do not believe that debating this stuff on social media and Facebook gets anybody anywhere. But when I take my conversations offline and I'll just instant message a friend, or I will ask them, and they may have very different political views, but I think they know that it's coming from a place of sincerity that I really want to understand. And I'm able to then share my side and they understand me more. We may not have changed our positions, but we came closer to understanding each other, and we did it without animosity. And if more people could do that, we would be far better off as a society.
For people working in marketing, how can people working in marketing make better use of some of these principles to make their campaigns stand out?
Okay. Well, the first thing to note about these principles, like most decision-making, they operate at the subconscious level. Depending on what literature you read, anywhere from 85 to 95% of our decision-making happens at the subconscious level. I think it was Martin Lindstrom in his book Biology put the number at 85%. Leonard Mlodinow in his book Subliminal put it at 95. So let's just split the difference and say 9 out of every 10 decisions we make, we're not even aware of, because we have learned and relegated to the subconscious and we're operating on autopilot. when you understand these principles of influence, you realize they are the driver of so much of human interaction and our ability to influence each other. So incorporating them as much as possible ethically into the things that you're doing is going to make more people move in your direction. And I'll give you one example. We just did a workshop last week, and I co-led this workshop, and Dr. Phelps, who was teaching about scarcity, talked about when the new Bose wave system came out. Initially, sales were a little bit disappointing. Robert Cialdini had worked with them and was blown away by how good the sound was. And he thought to himself, man, I can't believe I've been missing this all this time. And that's where the light bulb came on. And that became part of the brand messaging. Instead of, new Bose wave system and all the things that you typically see in commercials and advertisements, it became, hear what you've been missing. Now that taps into the principle of scarcity. Now, I'm sure that people weren't going, oh my gosh, what have I been missing? But at the subconscious level, it was registering like, oh, what am I missing here? And then they would listen and were blown away. And I think it was that one small change helped their sales go up by 45% compared to prior to that. So it's a small thing, a seemingly small thing, but it had an outsized impact on them.
That's a great example. 45% sounds massive in terms of sales. Switching gears a little bit and talking about the current times. People are socially distant, and most people are working from home, talking to a screen most of the times than to people in person. What should be kept in mind from an influence and persuasion standpoint?
Well, I think take advantage of the screens would be number one, because if you and I were not recording this over Zoom, but just over the phone, it wouldn't feel quite the same. I wouldn't know exactly what you look like and how you interact when you're talking with somebody live. So I say, I know we hear about Zoom fatigue, but take advantage of it. If you can't be with somebody, this is the next best thing. Then you realize, too, that because you and I are not together, there was no handshake, there was no physical contact, there's no opportunity for oxytocin to flow to create trust. And so you have to start looking at other ways to potentially create trust. And one of those, in terms of when you're interacting with people in a business sense, you want them to view you as having some kind of expertise. So it's critical that they understand what your expertise, what your background is before you start interacting with them. When you and I talked, you already knew who Robert Cialdini was. You read my book, so you already had some background to say, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. That's why I want to have him on the show. If that hadn't happened, then you might not want to have that interaction. So True. My encouragement to your listeners is take advantage of the opportunity to get your credentials in front of people, to build a little bit of authority, create a sense of trust that you know what you're talking about. And then when you get the opportunity to interact, back it up by what you say and what you do.
We talked a little bit about using a lot of these principles in the professional setting. What about at home? Can you give us some example, maybe an example from the book that could enhance life at home?
I think a big thing is engaging this principle that we call consistency. And consistency tells us that people feel an internal psychological pressure, but also an external social pressure to be consistent in what they say and what they do. Where most people fall short, whether it's in business or at home, is they tell people what to do rather than asking. And if you take time to ask, then you're not being seen as authoritative because that other person has a choice. But the smart persuader also asks, having fallback positions, recognizing, what if that person says no to doing something for me by Friday? What if it's my spouse or my kids? Then maybe I want to ask them to do it by Tuesday, because if they say no, I can fall back to Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And when you learn about the research in reciprocity, you realize that once somebody has said no to you, if you fill that space with another request, you're likely to get a yes following that. Then there are other things that we can do too, where we don't just ask, but we ask with a reason. So we use the word because. And studies show when you use the word because, you get significantly more compliance. So instead of telling somebody what to do, you ask, you give a reason, you have fallback positions, and all of these things make it easier. So a quick example would be, instead of saying to my daughter, empty the dishwasher, I'd say, Abigail, would you empty the dishwasher before you leave for work? Now, she might say, I can't, I'm in a hurry. But then I'll say, hey, wait a minute, then will you empty it as soon as you get home before you leave to do anything else? Yeah, I will. Virtually every time she would do it, because she wasn't being directed, but she was being asked. And once she voluntarily says yes, she is far more likely to actually follow through on that.
So you're saying that if you target the logical side of the brain by giving a reason behind the person doing it, they are more likely to follow up on that.
I wouldn't even say it's the logical. There's a study by a lady named Ellen Langer who was at a photocopy shop. And when people would come up to the front of the line and say, excuse me, I have 5 pages to make, may I go ahead of you? Or I have 5 pages to copy, may I go ahead of you? 60% of the people were generous and said, sure. But when that same person approached different people at different times and would say, excuse me, I have 5 copies to make, may I go ahead of you because I'm in a rush? Almost everybody, 94%, said, sure, go ahead. But then in a third variation, the person would go up and say, excuse me, I have 5 copies to make. May I go ahead of you because I need to make these copies? And now you think, well, wait a minute, we're all in line to make copies. That's a bogus reason. But 93% of the people let that person go ahead of them. The social psychologists theorize it's the simple conditioning of the word because. That when you were young and you ever questioned mom or dad, why? Most of the time they just said, because I said so. Well, that you didn't say, hey, mom or dad, that's not a logical reason. You just got in gear and you did what you were being told. So that conditioning doesn't go away. And as much as possible, one, I think it's just the right thing to give people legitimate reasons, but use the word because and make sure that you give that reason, and you will be much more successful at influencing people's behavior.
One of the stories that you have shared is the 700,000 reasons to use sticky notes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
When I worked for an insurance company, I came back from an extended Christmas break and almost immediately was called into a room with half a dozen other people. And here's the situation we faced. We came to realize that we had accidentally doubled the commissions for some of the insurance agents in one of our states over the month of December. We overpaid 150 agents a total of $700,000. So it was a huge error. And our charge was to figure out how do we get that money back as quickly as possible. Now, this was back a few years and we couldn't press a button and electronically pull it out. So after the half dozen of us debated on what we were going to do, we had to settle on this. A letter was going to have to go out from the home office accounting manager to each of those agents asking him or her to sit down and write a check as quickly as possible. So you have a lot of things going against you. You know, the home office accounting manager, a guy that these people have probably never seen, maybe never even spoken to on the phone. He's in a state 500 miles away, and he's sending this letter that says you owe us $4,000, $6,000, $10,000. So we knew it was going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah.
But fortunately for the accounting department, I had done some training the year before, and what I had taught them was going to come into play on this particular situation. I shared with them research regarding the use of yellow sticky notes. And I won't go deep into the research, but I'll just tell the listeners that in 2 separate studies, using a yellow sticky note that was personally signed doubled the response rate when they had sent out a survey, a request for surveys. So knowing that, I turned to the home office accounting manager and I said, Steve, you remember what I taught you guys about the sticky notes? And he said, yeah. And I said, if you don't have time to put a sticky note on every one of those 150 letters, call me, I'll come do it. And then he remembered and he goes, no, I remember and I'll do it. So we send those letters out. Every one of them has a yellow sticky note with a handwritten note from Steve on it. And when I called him a few weeks later and I asked him, how's the collection going? His exact words were, I'm floored. And I said, why? And he said, we've already gotten money back from 130 of the 150. Now, the optimist in me said, you mean we didn't get it all back? And he did what you did. He laughed at me and he goes, come on, man, we're talking about money. He goes, I fully expected people to say, you know, it's your problem, you fix it, or take it out of next month's commission, put me on a payment plan, anything except sit down and write that check. He goes, I am floored. And when we had lunch a few months later, and I asked him, how'd the collection end up? He said, we got money back from 147 of the 150 in full.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So he was blown away. I mean, because here's a guy who deals with people and money, and he knows how people can be about that.
We touched briefly on sort of the negative connotation that comes with influencing, which is manipulation.
When we do workshops, this is a section that we spend time on because we want people to feel comfortable with their newfound knowledge. You have a distinct advantage over other people when you understand how people typically think and behave. So with great power comes great responsibility. Now, I also recognize too that entire college courses are taught on ethics and books are written on it. But we need something that we can checklist quickly to know that we're operating in an ethical manner. And there's 3 things that we talk about. The first is truthfulness. We tell the truth, but we also don't hide the truth. You know, it's not enough for me, Rachit, to be truthful with you if I'm also withholding information that might impact your decision making. And if you made a decision and then looked at the information I withheld and said, hey, Brian, why didn't you tell me about that? If I said, well, Rachit, you didn't ask me, that's not defensible, right?
True.
So we tell the truth and we don't hide the truth. But what we learn through influence is even if something might be perceived as a negative, depending on how we present it, we can actually gain credibility as an honest person. So that's our first criteria. The second criteria is we only use the psychology that's natural to the situation. So for example, if scarcity is not truly available, don't force it. If everybody's not doing something, social proof, then don't force that. Look to other principles to naturally inform people into a yes position, but do not dishonestly use these principles. And then the third thing that we talk about is we want to create a situation that's not just good for you as the influencer. It obviously is. That's why you're trying to influence somebody, but it's got to be good for the other person. And I usually put it this way, good for you, good for me, then we're good to go. If what I know I'm putting on the table is going to be beneficial to you, it's okay that it's beneficial to me too. If we both benefit from this, then we are good to go forward.
What advice would you have for your younger self?
I wish I would have started studying this a lot earlier because I really believe it is a key to professional success and personal happiness, our ability to ethically influence people. And I know that this is something I was always interested in because of all the college courses I had. One of the things that stood out the most was a Psych 101 class that I was in. And I was fascinated when the professor talked about his 5-year-old son who he said, if my wife says it's cold outside, put on your mittens, as a little 5-year-old asserting himself, he would say no. But then the professor said, the way I approach it is I say, it's cold outside. Are you going to wear your blue mittens or your red mittens? And that little boy would say something like blue. Of course, now his hands are warm. And so the professor's happy. And that's stood with me for over 30 years. So I know I was interested in this, but I just didn't go deep enough. I didn't have anybody encourage me to say, hey, Brian, when you get into not just the work world, but really all of life, psychology is at the root of it. Understanding how people think and behave, and then being willing to work within those parameters and not just assert what you want and how you think things should be, but operating within the rules of how people think and behave would be so important. And I would encourage my younger self, dive deeper into that stuff much sooner.
Is there a right time to do that? Maybe when you're 14, 17, 20, is there sort of when you are entering college, is there a right time where you sort of will understand these principles better?
It would just be a guess on my part to say that I don't think there's any specific research, but I do think college is a great time because you are really growing and changing, being, you know, if you go away to school, you're on your own, you're responsible for yourself, you're having to make new friends because you're not within those people who maybe you grew up with. So really then beginning to understand how people think and behave can become so important to getting into clubs. You know, if you're in a club, you know, maybe you want to be the president of that club, and how can you ethically move people to say, hey, you're the guy, you're the lady that I should be voting for. There's so much opportunity in that, the whole dating scene, and shortly thereafter, many people are getting married and having kids. So the earlier you learn it, the better.
I also want to talk a little bit about perception versus persuasion. What role does perception play in persuading someone?
I think perception is huge. I would translate perception as understanding you or the person that you're trying to influence. So for example, because we're on Zoom and I'm holding my hand up and you see my hand, and if I were to ask you to describe it, the description would be different than mine, because you see the palm of my hand and I see the back of my hand, but we would both agree that we're looking at a hand. So for me to say, well, tell me about your viewpoint on this, and then to maybe ask permission and say, can I tell you about my viewpoint? That becomes critically important, I think, in influencing people. Here in America, we've just gone through yet another election. And part of the huge problem is people don't try to understand the other person's perspective. But when you understand the rule of reciprocity, that feeling of obligation you may have to give back to me what I have first given to you. So if I give you respect, and if I say, Rachit, I really want to know your viewpoint on this candidate, your viewpoint on these issues, and I do that with curiosity, and I ask questions and I allow you to share, it's very likely that you're going to say, well, how do you view that, Brian? And even if you don't, I can step in knowing reciprocity is at play and say, Rachit, could I have a moment to share with you my perception? And because I've given you that time, you're probably willing to give me that time. This is how we end up having conversation rather than shouting matches and things. It's a desire to really understand. And it's so important, especially in a political time, because I know people on both sides of the aisle who are really good people. I call them friends. They're good people. They're not these negative racist people on the one side, and they're not these liberal baby killers on the other side, which people tend to label. They're good people who view the world differently. And the best thing we can do is try to understand each other and say, what do we have that's in common? And how can we, let's set aside the differences for a while. Let's put together what we have in common and see what we can build from there. And I think the more you work with people and have success and gain respect, et cetera, the more opportunity you're going to have them listen to you and maybe shift opinions about other things so that we can mold something that works together. So for me, that's where perception comes in. It's about understanding how you view things before I just try to impose my will, my desire. And in fact, that's really not even an ethical persuader, to come in and try to convince you of something without even understanding how you view that situation to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great point. Building influence on LinkedIn. What's a good way to go about that? Because most professionals today, that sort of becomes your entry to the corporate world, where you are trying to sort of sell yourself. Mm-hmm. What's a good way to go about that?
Well, one way a couple ways in building up your followers. I think first of all is always personalizing your message. Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to connect with you, I'm going to send out a request, but I'm going to make sure there's a personal message. Now, I know not everybody reads those. I think sometimes they just see it, they hit the accept. But then what I always do right after that is say, thanks for connecting. Because then a lot of times they get the message alert, they'll read that, and then they'll reply. Now we've got social media on a social level, and you never know where that conversation is going to go. The intent is not to sell somebody something, but if we get to know each other and you like what each other has to say, you become more open. I'm very proactive about reaching out to people. So later today, there's 15 people who are going to participate in a workshop I'm doing in December. I will reach out to every one of them today with a personal message about, hey, I know you're going to be participating. Look forward to meeting you. Let's connect here. And then I'll follow that up with another personal message. I've already put books in the mail to every one of them. So I'm going to engage some reciprocity there. So those are some simple things that we can do. The other thing that you want to focus on is your whole LinkedIn homepage. That is your resume on steroids. You've got to make that thing as robust as possible so people understand why they should want to connect with you. What is the expertise you have? Really think about it, work on it, craft it, have people give you feedback on it, occasionally review it and update it as you learn more about LinkedIn. But I can tell you, Rachit, the biggest client that I have is somebody who found me on LinkedIn. And they were looking specifically for somebody who was associated with Robert Cialdini and the kind of training that his book offers. And they found me and they chose me. And I know it's because I have a very robust LinkedIn profile. I work on it a lot.
You do a lot of workshops on the topic of influence. Can you share some exercises from the workshop that are fun and that helps people realize the aspects of influence and persuasion?
One thing that we do at the end of our 2-day workshop, which is a non-business example, but people really like it. After having gone through a day and a half of learning these principles very deeply, we put people into a scenario where they have to work as a group, and they have to, the situation is their son has been expelled from school. And they need to take all this psychology and build a persuasive argument to convince the school board to let this boy back in school. And people really enjoy it because they've had a day and a half thinking about business, and now they can think about something outside of that. So it stretches their thinking. That's one that everybody really, really enjoys. Something I do in a different workshop, I talk a lot about personality types and which principles are more effective with different personality types. And so when we put people into situations, and we may take the entire workshop and we say, you have one goal, and it's to convince, this business to do something, but you're going to talk to one personality style. Maybe it's the CEO, and you're going to talk to another personality style. Maybe it's one of the salespeople, and you're going to talk to somebody, a different personality style. Maybe their customer service, and then maybe a fourth personality style who's like a managerial accounting type. But it's the same product or service, but you're having to consider how these different people think about this. And there's different principles that will be more impacting with those. So people find that exercise really enjoyable too.
That's very, very cool. Thank you for doing this, Brian. I really appreciate your time. Where can people find you on LinkedIn? What's the right way to reach out to you?
Certainly on LinkedIn, and I can give a guarantee if you don't put a message in that you heard me on this podcast, I will send a message back and say, how did you find me? Because I like to know why people are reaching out, but it also gets us to the social part of social media. The other way is my website, which is influencepeople.biz. When people are out there, they can contact me through the website. My book's available there. There's just a tremendous number of podcasts that I've been on, videos, previews of my LinkedIn learning courses. So tremendous amount of information. All of it's free that's out there, except the book. Once you order the book, you're buying the book.
Thank you for doing this, Brian. Really, really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.